It happened in 1983, back when I was still a deputy sheriff in Missoula County, Montana. At the time, I lived in a small forest community tucked away on the edge of civilization. All around us were dense forests, towering mountains, and the constant murmur of rivers. Tourists rarely ventured here, only hunters or people who knew these woods like the backs of their hands. The locals were quiet and close-knit. Everyone knew each other, sometimes more than they wanted to. At the heart of our community were a few ranches that sustained the locals, one of which belonged to Connor and Emma Harper. Connor and Emma were in their mid-40s and widely regarded as one of the wealthiest families in the county. They had a large house perched on a hill, an expansive tract of land, and a forest where Connor raised livestock while Emma managed the household. The Harper Ranch always looked like something out of a postcard. An immaculate wooden house, sturdy fences, and rolling green pastures. But one thing made them stand out. Their son, Jamie. He was 10 years old, a late and much-anticipated child. A skinny, blonde-haired boy with an ever-present grin, Jamie was the picture of innocence. I often saw him sprinting across the fields with their dog or tinkering around near the barn. And then one day, Jamie disappeared. It was a typical autumn day with no warning of the tragedy to come. After breakfast, Jamie had told his mother he was going for a walk in the woods near their house. Emma, as usual, allowed it. She knew he wouldn't wander far. But this time, he didn't come back. By evening, Connor raised the alarm. They searched the entire property, calling for him, whistling, combing through the nearby woods. But there was no sign of Jamie. By nightfall, neighbors joined the search. And the next morning, Sheriff Phil Holden and I arrived to lead a full-scale search operation. Men scoured the forest with dogs while women and children combed the fields. But the woods were thick, and despite our efforts, we couldn't find a single trace of the boy. The first few days felt surreal, like Jamie had simply vanished. The police found no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing, no footprints. Nobody in the village had seen him after he left his home. These were wild woods, teeming with bears, wolves, and who knows what else. Rumors spread that he might have fallen victim to a wild animal, but Connor refused to believe it. Clenching his fists, he insisted Jamie was just lost and that we would find him. But everything changed on the 7th day. An old man named Walter and his granddaughter Annie, who were foraging for mushrooms deep in the woods, stumbled upon something strange. It was a torn piece of a red shirt, the very shirt Jamie had been wearing on the day he disappeared. It was smeared with dirt and blood. A lot of blood. They brought the shirt to the station, and Jamie's parents immediately recognized it. I'll never forget how Emma sat in the corner of the station, clutching that shirt and quietly weeping. Connor tried to stay strong, but his face was ashen, his eyes hollow. For them, it was confirmation of their worst fears. Jamie was gone. That week, tension in the village reached a breaking point. Parents were terrified for their children, refusing to let them play beyond their yards. Men armed themselves, while women whispered about something sinister lurking in the woods. Some blamed a bear, others wolves, but none of it explained where Jamie's body had gone. A few days later, as the search for Jamie began to lose steam, a man named Henry Cook came to the station. He was around 25 but looked older, tall and wiry with a patchy beard and a nervous demeanor. Henry had been working as a forest ranger for about a year, having moved to our county from a neighboring state. Nobody really knew why he had chosen our remote area, but there were rumors he was seeking solitude. His small cabin on the edge of the forest was the last point of habitation before the true wilderness began. Henry was an oddball, reserved and eccentric. which made him an outcast among the locals. Maybe it was his peculiar way of talking, jumping from topic to topic, or the fact that he never attended church or the local bar. He kept to himself, and people didn't trust him. Kids made up scary stories about him, calling him the weirdo in the woods, while adults steered clear. Henry didn't seem to mind. He avoided people as much as they avoided him, spending most of his time deep in the forest. But that day he looked troubled, even scared. He came into the station with muddy boots, a battered jacket, and worn jeans. Holding his cap in his hands, he glanced around nervously before speaking, his words tumbling over each other. "Sheriff Holden," he said, "I don't know how to say this, but something's out there. Something big. I've seen the remains, deer, dogs, even calves, ripped apart so bad it gave me chills. It's not a bear or wolves, I'm sure of it. And I've heard sounds. At night. At first I thought it was just the wind or predators, but now I'm certain it's something else. Loud, guttural, like growling. It scares the animals. Even my dogs won't leave the cabin at night." His words were unsettling, but Holden, ever the pragmatist, simply frowned. He wasn't the type to believe in monster tales, and Henry wasn't exactly a credible source. In the year he'd lived here, Henry had failed to win the trust of the townsfolk. He felt like an outsider, but the truth was, he made himself one. To the locals, he was an odd stranger and a strange oddity. The sheriff folded his arms across his chest. "All right, Henry. Thanks for letting us know. We'll see what we can do, but right now our priority is finding Jamie Harper. You understand? We've already combed the woods and haven't seen any sign of large predators or unusual activity." Henry frowned, clearly holding back a sharp retort. Instead, he slowly put his cap back on. "Suit yourself, Sheriff," he said with a nod. "But I'm telling you, this isn't a normal predator. You'd do well to check it out." With that, he left. When the door closed, Holden let out a sigh and shook his head. "That guy's not right," he said to me. "Maybe he's been alone out there too long, cabin fever or something. But we can't waste time chasing shadows when we've got a missing boy to find." I agreed, but something about Henry's tone stuck with me. He was strange, yes, but I could tell he was serious, and the fear in his eyes, that was real. A few days after Henry Cook's visit to the station, something happened that once again shook our little community. It was early morning, the sun just rising, when I received a call from the local clinic. Henry, the forest ranger, had been found on the outskirts of the woods in terrible condition. A passing farmer had discovered him. He was driving his truck along the old trail near Henry's cabin when he saw him lying on the ground, covered in blood. Sheriff Holden and I immediately drove to the scene. By the time we arrived, Henry had already been rushed to the hospital, but the area where he'd been found told its own story. Blood stained the ground and broken branches lay scattered as if there had been a violent struggle. The dry grass and fallen leaves were soaked with crimson streaks that trailed deeper into the woods. I scanned the ground meticulously, expecting to find paw prints or some evidence of an animal attack. But to my surprise, there were no tracks, no claw marks, no paw imprints, just blood. Lots of it, streaking in a narrow path toward a dense thicket. The sheriff suggested it might have been a bear. Black bears weren't uncommon in our forests, especially in the fall when they grew more aggressive while preparing for hibernation. But something about this didn't add up. A bear would have left claw marks on the ground or scratches on the trees, but there was none of that here. And Henry, as a forest ranger, would have known how to handle himself around wildlife. He wouldn't have been caught off guard so easily. We searched the area again but found nothing new. The trail of blood abruptly ended near the bushes, as if Henry had been flung there by some unseen force. With no further clues, we got back in the truck and headed to the hospital. When we arrived, the doctor told us that Henry had lost a lot of blood but had been stabilized. He had deep, jagged wounds on his arms and chest, as though something had tried to tear him apart with claws. The doctors immediately assumed it was a large predator, but even they admitted the injuries didn't match anything they'd seen before. The gashes were too chaotic, too deep, and oddly placed. Henry lay in a hospital bed, pale but conscious. His eyes were filled with a fear I rarely saw even in the most terrified people. As we approached, he slowly turned his head and began to speak. His voice was quiet, as if he still hadn't recovered from whatever had happened to him. Henry claimed he'd been attacked by a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Massive, dark, and muscular. It was a strange blend of wolf and bear. He said it moved faster than any bear he'd encountered, with a deliberate, almost calculated precision. He described hearing branches snapping behind him before it lunged at him from the bushes. He had barely enough time to raise his arms to protect himself, which was what likely saved him from worse injuries. The creature kept attacking until he managed to strike it with a rock or a stick. He wasn't sure in the chaos. After that, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Sheriff Holden listened carefully, but I could see he wasn't buying it. In his mind, it was a bear, nothing more, nothing less. Maybe even a grizzly, although they were rare in our area. Encounters like this were uncommon but not unheard of. Holden chalked Henry's story up to shock, exhaustion, or the disorienting effects of his injuries. But I wasn't so sure. Henry seemed too certain, too shaken. This wasn't the fear of a man who'd seen a bear. It was the terror of someone who'd encountered something beyond his understanding. We left the hospital with a heavy feeling. On the drive back, I stared out the window, turning Henry's words over in my mind, trying to picture this creature he'd described. If it was just a bear, why hadn't we found any tracks? Why did Henry speak of it as if it were something out of a nightmare? But like the sheriff, I had no proof. All we had were the words of a strange forest ranger whom no one in the community truly took seriously. A week after Henry Cook was discharged from the hospital, he returned to his cabin on the edge of the forest, even more reclusive than before. No one in the community paid much attention to his condition, dismissing him as the oddball who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sheriff Holden and I, meanwhile, found no trace of the mysterious creature Henry had described, and, as these things often go, the incident began to fade from memory. The search for Jamie Harper was officially called off around the same time. After 2 weeks without a single lead, the sheriff announced that every possible avenue had been exhausted. Jamie's parents, Connor and Emma, were left to grapple with their grief in an empty home. What had begun as a shared tragedy for the community soon devolved into a deeply personal conflict. Connor and Emma, once a seemingly perfect couple, began blaming each other for their son's disappearance. Emma accused Connor of being too absorbed in running the ranch and neglecting Jamie. Connor, in turn, said Emma had made the mistake of letting the boy wander into the woods alone. Their arguments grew louder and more frequent, and the tension in their home was palpable. Every time I drove past their house, I could see the lights on late into the night, their raised voices carrying into the darkness. It was heartbreaking to see a family, once a cornerstone of our community, unravel so completely. One night, the tension reached a breaking point. Exhausted by the accusations, Emma packed her belongings and left. It was well past midnight, and the sky was heavy with clouds threatening rain. She set out on the path to her parents' house, who lived nearby, but she never made it. The next morning, local hunters found her body on the trail cutting through the woods. The scene was horrifying. Her body had been torn apart, her chest and arms shredded with deep, jagged wounds. Scattered beside her were the belongings she had been carrying. We carefully examined the area. There were bloodstains and trampled bushes, as though something or someone had forced its way through the underbrush. But as before, there were no tracks, no clear evidence. Even the dogs we brought in couldn't pick up a scent. They whined, skittishly circling the area, but refused to venture deeper into the woods. It was unsettling, to say the least. Sheriff Holden maintained his stance that it was a bear attack. To him, it was a logical conclusion. A grizzly could have come down into the valley looking for food, and the rain from the night before could have washed away any tracks. I understood his reasoning, but something about this didn't sit right with me. The circumstances were too strange. The tragedy shook the community to its core. Suddenly, everyone believed there was something dangerous lurking in the woods. People locked their doors and windows at night, kept their children close, and avoided the forest unless armed. Every day, whispers filled the store and the church as neighbors speculated about what could be responsible. Some suggested it was an unusually large grizzly that had wandered into the area. Others speculated about wolves, though we hadn't found any sign of them either. But a few began to recall old Native American legends that had been passed down through the generations. They spoke of the skinwalker, a shapeshifter that could take the form of an animal to stalk humans, or the wendigo, a demonic creature that hunted when consumed by bloodlust. Such tales had always been dismissed as folklore meant to scare children, but now with everything that had happened, people were starting to wonder. I overheard an elderly woman at the general store whispering that the creature that killed Emma was no ordinary predator. "It's not a bear," she murmured. "Not a wolf. It's something else. Something that doesn't belong here." Meanwhile, Connor Harper, who had lost both his wife and son in a matter of weeks, became a shadow of his former self. His once strong frame now stooped, and his face seemed to have aged 10 years. He rarely left his house and avoided speaking to anyone. But then, one day, he came to the station. I remember the way he entered, hesitant, almost dazed. He sat down across from Sheriff Holden and began to speak. His voice was quiet, barely audible, but it carried a deep, unsettling fear. He told us that strange things had been happening around his house at night. Several times he had seen a shadow pass by his window. At first he thought it was just an animal, but one night he gathered the courage to look out. What he saw froze him to the core. Connor described a creature, massive, dark, with glowing eyes, that stood outside his house, seemingly peering inside, watching him. It moved too quickly to be a bear, and its silhouette was unlike any wolf he had ever seen. He insisted it was something else, something entirely unfamiliar. He said he had grabbed his rifle, but by the time he returned to the window, the creature was gone. Sheriff Holden listened, nodding, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. To him, it was obvious. Connor was a man crushed by grief, suffering from stress, sleepless nights, and possibly even hallucinations. The sheriff advised him to rest and consider speaking with a doctor. Sheriff Holden remained steadfast in his belief that all the recent tragedies in the county were the work of a bear. His theory made sense on the surface. A large predator, possibly a grizzly, had ventured closer to human settlements in search of food, causing the chaos we were witnessing. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit. Why hadn't we found any tracks if it was a bear that attacked Emma? Why did the dogs refuse to follow the trail, as though their instincts warned them to stay away? And what about Connor's claims of a strange creature stalking his home? Too many details felt out of place. The deeper I considered it, the less this felt like a series of unfortunate accidents and the more it resembled something deliberate. If I dismissed the bear theory, a disturbing pattern emerged. A string of strange events, all connected by one common thread: the Harper family. I couldn't ignore it. If someone or something was targeting this family, there had to be a reason. And to find that reason, I decided to dig into their past. I started with the archives at our station. We kept basic records on all residents of the county: birth certificates, tax filings, land deeds. As I flipped through the Harper's files, my attention was drawn to Jamie's birth certificate. At first glance, it looked normal, but then I noticed something odd. His birthplace was listed in a neighboring state. That struck me as strange. The Harpers had lived in Montana for generations. Their family was well known in the county. So why had their son been born elsewhere? It was the first sign that their story wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The next morning, I drove to the town listed on Jamie's birth certificate. Their courthouse housed the county archives, and I hoped to uncover more details about his birth. Admittedly, I felt a pang of guilt digging into their past. Connor and Emma had been through enough, and the last thing I wanted was to cause them more pain. But something in my gut told me that these records might hold the answers I was looking for. What I found changed everything. Jamie wasn't their biological child. He had been adopted 10 years earlier when Connor and Emma were already in their mid-30s. The adoption had gone through the local child welfare office, but the details were far from ordinary. The records were, to put it mildly, unusual. The biological parents were listed as unknown and under special circumstances. There was a vague note about an emergency transfer. I didn't know what that meant, but the oddities raised a dozen new questions. Why had the Harpers chosen this particular child? And why had they never spoken of the adoption? Driving back to the station, my mind raced. What if this discovery was the missing piece of the puzzle? What if the events surrounding the Harper family weren't random at all? It was possible that someone from Jamie's past, his biological family perhaps, knew where he was. Or, worse, that someone was deliberately hunting the Harpers. That would explain Jamie's disappearance, the bizarre attack on Henry Cook, and the brutal death of Emma. The more I thought about it, the more the tragedies felt connected. Sheriff Holden thought I was overthinking things. He preferred simple, logical explanations, and I knew he thought I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on to something. These weren't coincidences. Someone, or something, had set its sights on the Harpers. And if that was true, it meant I was the only one who could uncover the truth. After Emma Harper's case was officially closed, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. The lack of evidence, or rather, the absence of anything concrete, continued to haunt my thoughts. But what troubled me even more was Henry Cook's behavior. Over the past few weeks, I had crossed paths with him several times, and each time, he seemed more anxious. Henry, already a solitary man, had withdrawn even further. When he did speak, there was a tremor in his voice, something between unease and outright fear. He constantly glanced over his shoulder, as though he expected someone, or something, to be watching him. He avoided meeting my gaze entirely. The tension radiating off him was impossible to ignore. I couldn't let it go. Henry was a forest ranger, a man who knew the woods better than anyone else in the county. If anyone had noticed something unusual tied to the disappearances and attacks, it would be him. But what if he knew more than he was letting on? Determined to find out, I drove out to his cabin, hoping to confront him directly. If he was hiding something, I needed him to come clean. By the time I reached his cabin on the forest's edge, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The house looked as decrepit as ever. Peeling paint, warped wooden siding, and a yard littered with debris. I knocked several times, but there was no answer. It was possible he was out in the woods again, but I wasn't going to let this lead slip through my fingers. I tried the door and found it unlocked. With hesitation, I stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was even more chaotic than the outside. Animal pelts hung on the walls, many yellowed with age. Papers, maps, and scribbled notes were piled in messy heaps across the room. On the table lay a collection of maps, marked up with various annotations. I picked one up, and my breath caught. Several locations were marked, places I immediately recognized. The spot where Jamie's clothing had been found, the trail where Emma's body was discovered, and another, deeper in the woods, circled boldly in red. A chill ran through me. This wasn't the work of someone merely studying the forest. It looked like a route, or perhaps even a plan. Why had Henry marked these places? What was he searching for? Or, more disturbingly, what was he trying to hide? Henry himself was nowhere to be found. Determined to act, I returned to town and gathered a group of hunters and volunteers. If something truly dangerous was stalking the woods and threatening our community, we needed to find it, and fast. Using Henry's map as a guide, we planned to start at the location he had marked in red. 3 days into the search, just as we were beginning to lose hope, we stumbled across something unexpected. Deep in the forest, where the trees grew taller and denser, we found an abandoned cabin. Hidden by thick undergrowth, it was nearly invisible from the main trail. The structure was old and decrepit, with a sagging roof and broken windows, but inside, we were met with a shock. The walls were lined with tools, whips, collars, and other items that looked like they'd been used to train or control animals. The floor was caked with dirt and what appeared to be dried blood. In one corner lay a pile of old newspapers and photographs. I picked up one of the photographs and froze. It was Henry Cook. He stood beside an older woman I didn't recognize, but their connection was unmistakable. They looked like mother and son. What began as an attempt to find answers to the strange events in the county quickly escalated into something much darker. Henry Cook wasn't just an incidental figure in this story. His behavior, the discoveries in his home, and now this cabin suggested he either knew far more than he let on or was directly involved in the chaos. I had to figure out who he was and what tied him to the Harpers. I started with the photograph from the abandoned cabin. The woman looked weary and aged, but there was something in her expression that wouldn't let me forget her face. Using the resources available at the station, I ran a search for Henry's connections, hoping to identify her. After a few days, I got a result. She was his adoptive mother, Mary Cook. She lived in a small town in the neighboring county. I decided to pay her a visit, hoping she could shed light on Henry's past. Mary's house was as modest and rundown as Henry's cabin. She was older than I expected, but her memory was sharp. She told me Henry had been adopted when he was just 2 years old. His biological parents had given him up due to congenital physical defects, something to do with his hands, though she couldn't recall the exact details. She explained that despite her efforts to give him a loving home, Henry had always struggled with feelings of abandonment. And then she said something that stopped me cold. Henry's biological parents were Connor and Emma Harper. They had given him up shortly after his birth, unable to cope with his condition. Years later, they adopted Jamie to fill the void left by their decision. But Henry had discovered the truth. Mary revealed that he had found the adoption papers several years ago, and it had completely changed him. He became withdrawn, consumed by his past. She suspected he had been keeping tabs on his biological family, but had no idea how far he might have gone. I decided to dig deeper into the Harper family and uncover what could have tied them to the string of tragedies that had recently befallen them. My starting point was the house they lived in, a weathered wooden structure perched atop a hill, standing out among the surrounding buildings. Locals always spoke of it with reverence, as it was a family legacy passed down through generations. But as I discovered, the history of the house was far more complicated than I had imagined. I found out that the house hadn't always belonged to Connor Harper. Before him, it was owned by his uncle, Richard Harper. Richard was a reserved, and by all accounts, stern man. He lived alone, never married, and his land and home were considered valuable assets in the community. Upon his death, the house passed to Connor, but not without an unexpected twist that few knew about. As I started asking around, one of the older locals revealed some startling details. Shortly before Richard's death, a family secret came to light, shaking the Harpers to their core. Richard had an illegitimate daughter no one had known about. Through old records, I uncovered that this daughter was Emma, Connor's wife. I had to sit down and process this. If it were true, then Connor and Emma were blood relatives. This raised a cascade of questions. Did they know before they got married? Why would they choose to marry if they knew they were related? Or was this revelation a shock to them as well, surfacing only after their union? I delved into their relationship's history. Emma arrived in our town about 20 years ago from a neighboring state. She was young, ambitious, and quickly gained attention. Soon after, she met Connor, who was just starting to manage the family ranch. They married a few years later. To outsiders, they appeared to be the perfect couple. No whispers of scandal or strife. The truth about Emma being Richard's illegitimate daughter surfaced later during the inheritance process. This revelation ignited a fierce conflict within the family. Some relatives contested Emma's claim to the property, arguing that an illegitimate child had no inheritance rights. Connor stood by his wife, and after prolonged disputes, the house remained with them. The pieces of this intricate family puzzle began falling into place. On one side was Henry, a neglected child who later discovered the identity of his parents and likely felt betrayed. On the other side were Connor and Emma, whose lives were built on tangled and concealed truths. Were these facts mere coincidences, or were they part of something larger? One thing was clear. The key to unraveling everything lay within these family ties, and to uncover the truth, I had to dig deeper. The realization that Connor was in grave danger gnawed at me. All clues pointed to Henry. His past, his behavior, and the discoveries in his home and the abandoned shack suggested he wasn't just a bystander. He was an active participant. His motives became clear. It was revenge. Revenge for being abandoned, for years of isolation, and for the secrets his biological parents had buried. But I couldn't let that revenge claim another life. I knew Henry would return. Everything pointed to it. Connor was the last link to his past, and Henry was determined to finish what he started. So I set a trap near the Harper house. Armed with a gun and a flashlight, I hid in the bushes at the edge of the woods, where I had a clear view of the backyard. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. Connor was inside as we'd agreed, with all doors locked and lights out. The night was eerily quiet, making every rustle of leaves or gust of wind unnerving. My heart pounded faster than I wanted to admit. I didn't know exactly what I'd encounter, but I knew it wouldn't be an ordinary criminal. Hours dragged on, stretching the night into an eternity. Around 2 a.m., I heard a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Branches snapping. The noise was faint but deliberate, as if someone was carefully making their way through the woods. I shone my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. The beam reflected off wet leaves, creating shadows that danced like phantoms. And then I saw them. Henry emerged from the forest. His silhouette was unsettling, tall, gaunt, clad in dirty, torn clothes. But it wasn't just him. Behind him, something moved. At first, I thought it was a large animal, a wolf or maybe a bear. But when it stepped into the moonlight, I felt a chill run down my spine. The creature was massive, far larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in filthy black fur that gleamed with moisture. Its head seemed disproportionate, with an elongated snout dripping with saliva. But its eyes were the most terrifying part. They glowed with a predatory yellow light, full of rage and intelligence. The beast moved with an unnerving grace, its every step deliberate and powerful. It wasn't just following Henry. It moved as if it were his partner, a weapon he had brought with him. I waited until they got closer to the house. The beast froze, tilting its head as if listening. I aimed my gun, finger poised on the trigger. But Henry suddenly turned, as though sensing my presence, and shouted something to the creature. It lunged forward. Everything happened in a blur. I fired, hitting the beast in the side. It let out a bone-chilling roar, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard, a mix of pain and fury. It stopped but didn't fall. Turning its glowing eyes on me, it charged. I fired again, this time hitting its front leg. It staggered, hesitated, then turned and retreated into the woods. I was ready to give chase, but a movement in my peripheral vision stopped me. Henry was trying to escape. He bolted toward the forest, but I caught up to him. He fought back, thrashing wildly, but his strength quickly gave out. I wrestled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. Henry shouted incoherently, his words a jumble of anger and desperation, as though he were a man possessed. During interrogation, Henry looked exhausted but not broken. His gaunt face was pale, and his eyes burned with a strange mix of defiance and weariness. He wasn't someone who planned to stay silent. On the contrary, he started talking almost as soon as he sat in the interrogation room. His words sounded like a confession, but there wasn't a trace of remorse in them. Henry admitted to orchestrating all the attacks on the Harper family. To him, it wasn't a crime but a form of justice. He discovered his origins a few years earlier when he found documents his adoptive mother had hidden in an old trunk. That moment turned his life upside down. He learned he had been abandoned by the very people who should have loved him most. His biological parents, Connor and Emma, had given him up to an orphanage because of his congenital physical defects, erasing him from their lives. To Henry, this decision was the ultimate betrayal. At first, he didn't know how to process this information. He was hurt, feeling unwanted and discarded. But over time, that pain morphed into rage. He found out that the Harpers had later adopted Jamie, a boy who, in Henry's eyes, had taken his place in the family. That realization was the final straw. He decided to take back what was stolen from him, or, at the very least, make the Harpers feel the same pain he had endured. Henry began crafting his revenge. It started one day when he found a stray puppy while walking through the woods. This wasn't an ordinary dog, but a hybrid of wolf and dog, teeming with wild, untamed energy. Seeing an opportunity, Henry took the animal in. He raised and trained the creature, transforming it into a weapon. Henry claimed the animal was incredibly intelligent, with predator instincts sharper than any ordinary canine. He used items tied to the Harpers, old clothing he claimed to have obtained through acquaintances, and even knitted goods Emma sold at local fairs. He trained the beast to recognize their scent and attack anyone who carried it. The attack on Jamie, Henry explained, was his first step. He wanted Connor and Emma to lose everything they loved. Then came Emma's turn. He had been watching their home, learning their routines, and waiting for the moment she would be alone. The beast did its job, leaving horror and pain in its wake. But according to Henry, things didn't go as planned. Henry confessed that the creature had grown beyond his control. As it matured, the hybrid became more aggressive and unpredictable. Even Henry began to fear it. Sometimes, it looked at me like it was ready to attack, he said, staring straight at me. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. It became something more, something different. He claimed that on the night of my ambush, he had gone to Connor's house not just to finish what he started. Henry intended to rid himself of the creature, luring it into a trap. He knew I was there and hoped I'd manage to kill the beast. I couldn't control it anymore. It started hunting on its own, and I knew that if I didn't act, it would kill me or someone else. Listening to him, I tried to discern where the truth ended and fabrication began. Henry seemed sincere, but his story was too disturbing to fully believe. Yet, given everything I had witnessed, I couldn't dismiss it outright. That creature, whatever it was, undoubtedly existed, and Henry's connection to it ran deeper than he was willing to admit. After Henry's arrest, we launched another search for the beast. Knowing how dangerous it was, I couldn't leave it roaming free, especially after hearing Henry's account. For days we combed the forest, starting from where I had injured it, but the animal had vanished without a trace. No blood, no tracks. It was as if it had evaporated, absorbed by the wilderness that had always concealed its secrets. The swamps in that part of the woods were vast and treacherous. Local hunters warned against venturing there, even during the day. It was too easy to get stuck or sink into the clinging mud. Perhaps the creature had retreated there, wounded and couldn't escape. Maybe it had drowned, swallowed by the murky depths, becoming one with the dark forest that had birthed it. But that thought didn't bring me peace. I had seen the creature's intelligence, its strength, its almost supernatural resilience. What if it had survived? What if it had simply retreated further into the wilderness beyond our reach? We called off the search after a week, finding no sign of it. No one reported seeing the creature again, and the forest grew silent once more. But for me, that silence was never the same. I knew that somewhere out there, something beyond our understanding might still be lurking. Henry Cook, meanwhile, was declared insane. His confessions, behavior, and the horrifying details of his plan left no doubt. Psychiatric evaluations concluded that he had acted under the influence of deep psychological trauma and a consuming sense of vengeance. He was committed to a high-security psychiatric facility, where he was to remain under observation for the rest of his life. I tried to imagine what Henry felt in confinement. A man who had grown up in loneliness, consumed by a sense of rejection, whose sole purpose had been to destroy the lives of those he blamed. Now he was isolated from the world entirely. I didn't pity him, but I couldn't shake the thought that in his mind, this wasn't just revenge. It was the desperate cry of a soul yearning to be seen and understood. He craved acknowledgement, even if it meant destroying everything he perceived as unjust. A few months later, I received word that Henry had taken his own life in his cell. The details were not disclosed, but I didn't need them. I knew his end was inevitable. He had left too many questions unanswered, even in his confessions. I would never know how he had acquired the Harpers' belongings, where he had found the beast, or whether he had ever truly controlled it, or if it had been controlling him all along. The case was officially closed. Years have passed since then, but the story has become a local legend. People in the community recount it with varying versions and details. Some believe the forest was home to something supernatural, a mysterious creature exacting its own form of vengeance. Others see it as a tragedy born of human pain, cruelty, and mistakes. Neighbors whispered about the Harper family's curse, about secrets that should never have come to light. Children claimed to hear strange growls at the forest edge or see glowing eyes in the darkness. But nothing was ever proven. The forest grew quiet again, though its silence always carried an oppressive weight. I returned to my work, but this story left a lasting mark. It was a reminder of how complex and dark human lives can be, how secrets buried in the past can become seeds of destruction, and how sometimes we encounter things that defy understanding. The beast, Henry, the Harper family, all became part of a dark chapter that will stay with me until the end of my days.